Okay, we'll make a start. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this talk. Today I wanted to focus on writing a thesis because I know most of you are up to that point at the moment. For those registrars who are finishing this year, their masters or their DCH, you've designed your study, you've conducted your research, you've collected your data, you've done most of the analysis, you've even developed the presentations, but the next step is to write your thesis. And I wanted to focus quite a lot on the act of thesis writing. That's what we'll talk about today. So I wanted to record this lecture early so you could watch it and then you can ask some questions if you want. So I will go back to some of the earlier steps in doing a research project, including what a good database should look like. But I am going to, as I said, focus more on the thesis and the thesis structure. I'll say something about the length. I'll say something about how to do a literature search using PubMed, because while some of you have done literature reviews for your proposal or during your research, you may still want to do a literature search to help with your introduction and help with your discussion. I'll talk about how to use the retrieved articles that you get from a literature search. So again, for the introduction, for the discussion, some people have a literature review chapter, but that's optional. And really for a DCH, I wouldn't put it in. I think you just use the other research that's been done in the area that you're studying, use that research that you retrieve from a literature review, use that for your introduction and your discussion. But some, certainly for a major thesis, for a PhD thesis, you have a literature review chapter, but mostly for a master's thesis, you don't need to do that. I'll say something about spreadsheets, as I said, because this is a general talk, and I'll talk a bit about tables and, again, a bit more about the writing and how you can write properly. There is no one way to write a thesis, and even though we say this is the standard thesis structure, there are many ways a thesis can be written. So I'll talk about a standard structure, but there are no particular rules, and universities don't have any particular rules about this. There are many tools to help, and so you can become an expert in tools within Word, Microsoft Word, or you can have a reference manager program like EndNote, or there's other ones called Reference Manager. You can use statistical programs. But if you've not mastered these tools, then it's not a problem. What matters really is the content and the quality of your research. So it's good to work towards understanding these tools, Word and statistical programs. But if you haven't mastered those things by now, don't worry too much about it. All right. As I said, what matters is the content and the quality of your research. You should write concisely. Some people write in a very verbose way, and they write extremely long theses. That's not necessary. You should write concisely. Only write things that matter. Don't write things that are very peripheral to your study. I always think it's useful to firstly read other people's theses. So in the postgraduate office where Lineth Polkus sits, in the School of Medicine, you'll see there are all the other theses going back a very long way, 20 years or more. And it's worthwhile getting out some theses to just have a look at what they did, the structure, how they presented their studies. And then after you've written or after you've drafted your thesis, have someone else read your thesis to see if they can understand it. And that can be someone who's not a pediatrician or a scientist or a doctor at all. That could be someone who's has some background in science or logical thinking, but not necessarily in the field in which you're writing your thesis, because the thesis should be understandable by someone who doesn't have a deep knowledge of the area that they're studying. Okay. I've shown you this before. This is all the steps that are involved in doing a research project, um, from coming up with the idea to having a clear research question, defining your objectives and hypotheses if that's appropriate, doing a review of the literature to work out whether or not that question's already been answered, or whether and how other people have tried to address it. Then coming up with a valid methodology to address the problem. And then there's a whole lot of steps in terms of that, in designing metrics of measurement, data collection forms, an ethics proposal, funding sometimes, and then developing a spreadsheet that reflects the data in the data collection form, and gathering the data and conducting the study. Now, most of you have done all of those steps up until now, but from here on in, you need to do the writing part of it. And most of you have developed an analysis plan, and you've done your main analyses of your studies. But now I want to talk about the writing. So commencing writing, which includes the introduction and the methods and the dummy tables. You can do that very early. Even you could have done that months ago, because you have the introduction and the methods already in your proposal. Most of you have written a proposal, so you can start with that and then expand it. I'll talk a bit about dummy tables a bit later, but they're, again, a helpful thing that you can help you plan your thesis and help you work out what information you need to get from your spreadsheets and your analysis to put into your thesis. And then comes the analysis and the writing, and then the production of a minor thesis. This is a standard thesis structure, and like I said, there's no one way to do it, but typically people have a title page, then a declaration, just to the university requires you to have a declaration. Most people include some acknowledgements of those who've helped them do the study, and then a table of contents. And I'll show you later in the talk how you can develop a table of contents. That can be done manually, or there are special ways within Word that you can do it, which I'll show you. Some people have a list of tables or figures or diagrams, just a list indicating what the figures, tables, and diagrams actually are. You don't need to do this. I think if you're writing a relatively small thesis, then you don't need to include that table. You do need to write an abstract, and that should be around about 200 to 300 words. And your abstract should be a structured abstract. It doesn't have to be a structured abstract, but I think it's probably useful if it's like an introduction, methods, results, and discussion, just a short abstract, 200 or 300 words. Then you write the introduction, which includes your objectives and the specific research questions you're asking. Remember, the introduction is why you did the study. What's the issue or the question that you're trying to address? Why was it important to you? And within that, what is the specific research question that you're trying to address? You may, again, the literature review that you do, you don't have to have a separate literature review chapter in a minor thesis. You should include something of that in the introduction, but more of that in the discussion. And I'll get on to what you include in your discussion later on. The methods is a very important part of your thesis, and that should be an exact description of what you did. So all the methods that you use should be written concisely but exactly in your methods. The methods should be written in a way that would enable somebody else to take those methods and reproduce your study and get the same answer, unless it's a different population or the context is different. But the method should be written in a way that clearly describes what you did, so that it's a transparent description of that. Then you write the results, which again they don't have to be very long. They're the key results that you found, separated into key areas of your inquiry, and then the discussion, which I'll talk a bit about later. And it's very important to, I would say, compartmentalize the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion, because they are very different. The discussion is not just a restating of your results. It's not that. And often I read discussions where people have just put their results, restated them in a different way. It's not that at all. I'll explain what the discussion is. And then you might have conclusions. Some people have recommendations. That's not necessary. You do need to have a reference list. And then some people add appendices at the end, which are sometimes your data collection form or the ethics approval form or something like that. Sometimes in appendices there are expanded results that you might have identified from your study that aren't important enough to be put in your thesis. You don't have to do that. It's something that some people do, especially for a PhD, but not so much for a DCH or a master's. Remember I said there's no fixed way, no fixed structure. Well, there's also no fixed length of your thesis either. Mostly it's about 2,500 to 4,000 words. And for a minor thesis, I think that's a good length, around about 3,000 to 4,000 words. It's a good length because it means that you've had to write concisely and not put information in that was not necessary. That's about 2,500 to 4,000 words of text, plus an abstract, which is 200 or 300 words, plus your references, plus tables and figures that illustrate your study. For a PhD thesis, it's often about 20,000 words. But remember, this is a minor thesis. And the good thing about writing concisely in 2,500 words is that that's the length of a journal article. So if you ultimately want to turn your thesis into a journal article, then you don't have to. I've had to take theses that are 10,000 words and try to make them into 3,000 words or 2,500 words for publication in a journal article, and that's quite a hard thing to do, to cull thousands of words from a thesis. So if you write it originally at 2,500 to 4,000 words, then it's much easier to cut, and it means you don't have to spend as much time, because writing 2,500 to 4,000 words should take you less than writing 10,000 words. And remember, you don't need to put all your data into your thesis. Don't put data in that's inadequate or irrelevant, but really try to make your thesis focused so that a reader will understand exactly what you were doing and why you were doing it and what you found, rather than putting a lot of extraneous information in that will make it broad and blurry. For a PhD thesis, often people put in a lot more information, but for a master's and a DCH, it should be fairly focused. Writing concisely is very important, and it's a skill to be learned. It's actually harder often to write concisely than it is to write lots of information, that much of which is unnecessary. I'm going to talk a bit about how to search the literature now, and just again, I'll do it very briefly, and you sort of really learn this most by doing it. But I want to try to explain how to use PubMed in a relatively simple way, and you'll learn more. You'll learn more than what I can teach you, but you'll learn more by actually doing it. But first of all, why would you search the literature in general? When you search the literature because you might want to explore a new therapy for a patient, for example. So the skills that you learn while doing your research are really transferable to skills that you need for being a good clinician or a good pediatrician. You might want to explore to understand the evidence for a new therapy that you've heard about or it's become available. You might want to answer a clinical question that relates to one of your patients. And so knowing how to search the literature and practicing it while you're doing your DCH and your master's is a good way to then address clinical questions that arise in your in everyday clinical practice. You may want to, like I said earlier, decide whether any further research is needed. So you might come up with a question, a research question, and that may already have been answered by somebody else. And so if so, it's pointless you doing it again in the same way, because unless the patient population is very different, or unless the context is very different, then you're likely to get the same answer. It doesn't advance the science. So when you are planning your research, you should do a literature search to see if anyone's already done that project, and if so, how did they do it, and whether or not it's still worth doing again. It might be worth doing again because it was done 20 years ago and it hasn't been reproduced. It might be worth doing it again because it's a different patient population, or because it's never been done in your country. It's only been done in different contexts, etc. So, as I said, you decide whether there's sufficient existing research that's relevant to the context in which you're practicing, as such that further research may be unnecessary, or if there's not enough research and you're still interested in the topic, then it helps you understand the methodologies that other people have used. Mostly while you're doing a literature review is for information for your introduction and your discussion. Remember, particularly for your discussion, the introduction can be very brief in your thesis. The discussion has to be a bit more expanded to include the research that's been done and the results that have been identified in other studies in similar contexts. Okay, so I'm going to just practice a brief review question, and the question I've used is the question actually that Melissa is doing for her master's project, and that's what's the evidence for using sildenafil in neonates with persistent pulmonary hypertension. And I chose this question because it has several parts to it. It has a therapy, it has a population, it has a disease process, and it's looking for evidence. So this is more what you would say a therapeutic efficacy question, right? I'll talk about other types of questions, but a therapeutic efficacy question. And some people call it a PICO question, P-I-C-O-T, PICO question, because somewhere within that you should know the population, which is neonates, the intervention, which is sildenafil, the comparator, which C for comparator, which could be nothing, or it could be some other therapy for pulmonary hypertension. The outcome being perhaps you need to think about what the relevant outcomes could be, such as improved oxygenation, duration of respiratory distress, resolution of respiratory distress, etc., survival or not. So the outcomes can be varied. And then the T is for time, because all efficacy questions have a time dimension. You're looking at the effect of a therapy within a given population compared with a comparator therapy over a particular period of time, right? And that time might be in the first month of life, for example. You might look at outcomes in the first month of life, or it might be in the first week, depending on how long you are able to monitor such babies. But getting back to the search, I put this into PubMed, and I wanted to sort of go through how you do it. So I put the first search into PubMed, sildenafil and pulmonary hypertension, or I put in the abbreviation PPHN because PubMed understands some key abbreviations, or it searches for keywords within abstracts of research projects, published papers, and neonate. And I got from that 324 results, which is a lot of papers. It seems like a lot of papers, but usually what you do then is scroll through those papers and say, well, I don't think that one's relevant, or that one's not relevant, or that one's not relevant. And so but these relatively small number are, but still 324 papers is a lot to go through. Having said that, some searches I've done yield thousands of papers, and you just have to meticulously go through them all to find the ones that you that are relevant to you. You might want to narrow the search a bit more, depending on the question you're asking and the context in which you're doing it. But for this purpose, I then narrowed the search to sildenafil and pulmonary hypertension and neonate. And that came, and developing country, because that then meant that it wasn't including studies that were done in neonatal intensive care units in the United States or in Europe, for example, where the context is very different. And maybe the question that you're asking, does sildenafil work in our context? That may not be answered by those international studies. So that honed the results down to just 7 results, and that's much easier, isn't it? You can read through all of those 7 papers and decide if any of them are relevant to your particular study. What I wrote in sildenafil and pulmonary hypertension and neonate and developing country seems a very simple search, but what PubMed does is expand the search. It automatically expands it to a lot of other fields, that search fields that you might not have even thought about. And so, for example, PubMed recognizes that sildenafil is also called sildenafil citrate, and therefore searches for that rather than just for sildenafil. And you might have thought of only neonate, but actually PubMed recognizes that neonates could be infants, they could be newborn infants or newborns. There's lots of different terms you could apply to a neonate. And so PubMed expands the search. You don't need to do anything. This is just in the background. And so what you put into PubMed is a relatively simple search, gets expanded without you even knowing it. This is the search outcome of this search: sildenafil and pulmonary hypertension and neonate and developing country. Now you'll notice that I've put the key terms in brackets, and the reason for that is because what you want, and I've put "and" between each of the key terms, and not just put the key terms sildenafil, pulmonary hypertension, neonate, and developing country. That would yield thousands and thousands of articles, about 9,000 when I did it before. If you put the search terms in brackets and put "and" in between, then it'll only find papers that have all of those search terms or their derivations within PubMed that I showed you just a moment ago. So this search came up with just 7 articles out of 9,000 because I put the search terms in that way, with brackets and with "and" between. If you put "or" between, then that will come up with papers that have all of those search terms, or any, I should say any of those search terms, not all of those search terms. But if you put "and" in between, then it'll only come up with papers that identify studies, published papers that have all of those terms. Okay, so the PubMed search came up with 7 studies. The first one I showed you it's really just sorted according to publication date. You can sort according to, you can use the display options to sort according to publication date, or you can search inversely of publication date, that is from oldest to youngest or youngest to oldest. You can display the abstract or just the titles and the reference, or you can display the entire abstract. You can search for under relevance, which sort of automatically searches it depending on the number of search terms that are included. But the way we've generated this search term, all of them are included in all the studies. So as I said, it identified 7 results from this PubMed search, and these were the results. And from this, there are many of these results are free online, and so not all of them, but many of them. And usually, PubMed identifies those, so you can see this free PMC article. There are probably others within this that are also, at least you can read the abstracts, if not the entire paper. But if you wanted to see this article, which is free online, then you click on it and you get the entire abstract. And then you see up here that it says free, read free full text at BMC or full text at PMC, and click on one of those, and then you get to the published paper, the full text of the published paper. And this one I highlighted because it's probably the most relevant to the study that's being done, that Melissa is doing, and most relevant to the research question of what's the evidence for using sildenafil in neonatal pulmonary hypertension. I won't go into that in more detail, but if you're searching an efficacy question, then that's the way you do it. But sometimes the questions we ask are not those PICO questions that I mentioned. Oh, yes, I should say that I also searched this under Google Scholar. So some of you will use, I always use PubMed. I sometimes use Google Scholar, but Google Scholar is very useful, but it identifies often many unrelated topics. It has a lot of duplication, and it can't be as easily focused as PubMed. It's sorted by relevance. So that means the first 7 articles or the first 100 articles will be the most relevant. And then the next ones, 5,000 onwards, won't be relevant at all. They might only have one of the words that you included in the search. But you can see that exactly the same search result using Google Scholar not Google, by the way, it's Google Scholar, which is a scientific arm of Google. It's a scientific search engine within Google. Don't search on just Google. You'll get lots of rubbish. But if you search on Google Scholar, is a relevant search engine for scientific publications. But it does identify usually more duplicated publications and irrelevant publications than PubMed. Both are free online, both are free, of course. So you can use either, but you can see that the same search strategy in Google Scholar identified 9,140 publications, whereas the search in PubMed identified the 7 most important. I did say this before, but many of the questions, some of the questions that we'll ask will be efficacy or effectiveness questions. That is asking a question about the effectiveness or the efficacy of a given treatment in a given population with a given disease. So they'll be what is often called PICO questions. So the population, the intervention, the comparator, the outcome, and the time. Now, but most of the research that you've done for your masters, most research that's done at a master's level or a DCH, are not exactly efficacy questions. We don't do too many controlled trials of a given therapy. We do more descriptive observational studies for a master's, and that's entirely appropriate. Often exploratory studies that might or might not lead on to some sort of efficacy study, but they're more descriptive observational studies. They're audits of practice, they're audits of outcomes, etc. And so they don't lend themselves to an efficacy question like a PICO question. So when you're looking at other types of questions for a literature review, again, often your search will not be about a treatment efficacy question. It might be that you're doing qualitative research, or you might do a search as a background to a general topic. And sometimes you'll want to do a search that's quite specific to Papua New Guinea or to wherever you're working. And sometimes you'll want to cast a wider net, so to all developing countries, for example, or even globally, see what research has been done in middle and high income countries elsewhere. So whether your search is very focused or whether it's rather broader depends on how many papers you want to entrain, how relevant research is when it's done in other similar countries to Papua New Guinea, etc. So you need to consider the relevance. So, for example, I just took the Dr. Levi's question or topic of teenage pregnancy and tried to understand how many papers had already been published on teenage pregnancy in Papua New Guinea. And again, there's 7 articles. Only 7 articles have been published that include the search terms teenage pregnancy and Papua New Guinea. Now, I widened the search to teenage pregnancies and developing countries and qualitative research, because if you put in teenage pregnancies and developing countries, you get hundreds of papers. But if you put in qualitative research, because that was the type of research that Hiagi has done, then that narrows the search a bit more. So this yielded 26 articles. Again, it's a matter of trial and error of putting different search terms in. This is the PubMed output, I should say. The type of output I showed you before, all I put into this search was teenage pregnancy in developing countries and qualitative research. And I limited, excuse me, I limited the publications to time limited just from the year 2000 onwards, because there were actually a lot of papers that were published last century in the 1980s and even 1970s that mentioned these terms that are probably not relevant today. And so you can, in PubMed, you can limit the publication date to a certain date, like 2000, the year 2000 onwards, and then you've got over 20 years of publications. You don't necessarily need to go back any further, but sometimes you do, because you want to know what was found, what the evidence was even earlier on. I've done searches way back to the 1930s or even earlier to understand the effectiveness of older therapies. But for most of the questions we're asking, we want contemporaneous research. We want to know what's most current, and so limiting your publication date can be useful, so that you don't have to sift through hundreds of articles just to find the most current ones. So this was, remember I said that PubMed has a way of expanding your search that you don't even know about. It doesn't matter that you don't know about it, but you can find what it expands it to. But the point of showing you this is that you might think, well, it might capture teenage pregnancies, but it might not capture pregnancies in adolescence, for example, because you haven't used those words. But actually it will, because PubMed recognises that teenage pregnancy is very similar to the term pregnancy in adolescence, so it includes that term as well, even though I only put in the more basic teenage pregnancy in developing countries and qualitative research. All right. So PubMed is a form of, I guess, artificial intelligence. It's quite smart. When you put in your search terms, it makes more of them than what you had originally thought. So that's why it came up with 26 publications. Okay. I won't go through this searching PubMed any more than this, but just to know it can be useful. Primarily at the moment, it's useful when you're thinking about what to put in your discussion and what to put in your introduction. Sometimes people do literature searches so they can do what's called a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is a compilation of similar studies that have looked at a similar research question that identify the effectiveness or the efficacy of a certain treatment or a certain treatment approach. Now, in the sorts of theses that you're writing for your masters, rarely, if ever, will a meta-analysis be needed. What you should write is a narrative review, which a narrative review is simply understanding what other studies have been done, summarizing those studies, understanding their limitations, critically appraising other studies in a simple way, and then working out how relevant those studies are or how related those studies are to the studies that you've done, and how much the collective knowledge of those studies plus your study tell you about the topic. When you're writing your, if you do a literature search, you must make sure that you keep the search criteria. Like I've shown you here, I've documented the search criteria. So my search criteria in the first one was sildenafil and pulmonary hypertension and neonate and developing countries. You notice there's an and before, between every word, and each word is in brackets to indicate that that's the papers have to contain all of those words. But you have to record your search criteria. You should record the number of studies that were identified in your search. So that search identified, I can't remember what it was, 324 papers, or was it just 7? I can't remember. But you just say what the number of studies were identified overall, the total number identified in your search, and then the number of studies you used, because you'll exclude a lot of studies from your search. If you come up with 30 studies, then you might exclude 15 because they're just not relevant. And you'll exclude those based on either reading the entire paper or just reading the abstract, or sometimes just looking at the title, because you can say based on the title, it's not relevant to your particular study. Although if you do a more focused search, then usually the titles are all relevant. If you identify only sort of 7 or 15 or 20 studies, mostly they're all relevant to your topic. But whether they directly address the question you're asking, you need to read at least the abstract, and often you need to read the entire paper. You should describe the studies in very briefly, like just one paragraph about each of the small number of studies that were highly relevant to your topic. Don't accept those other papers uncritically, because they probably, like your study, have certain limitations, and you need to try to understand the limitations of other people's research and also the limitations of your own research. Maybe the studies were too small, maybe the follow-up wasn't long enough, maybe they had a high loss to follow-up rate, maybe the methodology wasn't right. They're all limitations of research projects that people still publish, and so you need to be able to at least critically appraise other studies. And in the paragraph that you write about other studies, you can say something about their quality in an objective way. Sometimes doing a literature search, as I said, can help you establish the basis of doing your own project, because you identify that no other studies have been done, or no other studies in your country have been done, or in your context. And it also can help design the methodology, because you look at what studies that other people have done and you use that to help design your methodology, or more importantly, you use it in the discussion of your paper. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about data collection forms and spreadsheets. Now, I know that you're beyond that now, most of you, with your research, but I want to go back a bit so that I want to make sure that you've learned something about these basic aspects of doing research. Firstly, I showed you that at the start, all the steps involved in doing research. When you go from just an idea, you want to study neonatal sepsis, or you want to study pneumonia, going from an idea to a research question is an important step. And you should ask a question that can be answered by a research project, or by a study, a type of study. And then you have to decide what method is appropriate for that question. There are some methods that are appropriate for certain questions, and some methods that are entirely inappropriate for that particular question. I won't go into that too much more, because it's really about learning about all the different methods that we've discussed, like case reports and case series and case control studies and cohort studies and randomized trials, non-randomized controlled trials, meta-analysis, etc. I won't talk about different methods, but apart from those types of methods, there are prospective and retrospective methods, etc. There are methods. There's a lot of detail in the method, but the method should be appropriate to the question that you're asking. And that's why you need to work with your supervisors to really define your method first. The data collection form that you have designed should reflect your questions, right? And you should design and pilot a data collection form and make sure that you can collect all the information, that you've thought about each of the data points that you're collecting and thought about what the metrics of measurement are for those data points, whether you're measuring things in days, weeks, months, in time, in certain weights, etc. Think about what the metrics of measurement are for that particular data point in your data collection form. So you need to work again with your supervisors to develop your data collection form, and it should reflect the question or questions that you ask at the beginning. Your spreadsheet that you develop should reflect the data collection form. And I try to make sure the spreadsheet is almost a copy of the data collection form, so that when you've got your data collection form and you're collecting your data, then you can easily put it into your spreadsheet. There are now modern methods of data collection forms that are all electronic sometimes, so you can add things to your data, add data to your data collection form, and that can sometimes automatically appear on a spreadsheet. Most of us are not at that level, and so we still have a paper-based spreadsheet, but a paper-based data collection form, but you need to put it on something electronic at some stage. I'm going to talk a bit more about spreadsheets in a moment. Now, a spreadsheet should be analyzable to answer your questions. And early on in your research, you really need to, when you've made your data collection form, when you've developed your spreadsheet based on your data collection form, you need to road test your spreadsheet to see if it'll answer the questions that you designed it to answer, right? And I just want to make some points about spreadsheets. The spreadsheet, as I said, should reflect your data collection form, and so put it in the same order so it's easy to enter your data. You need to think about the types of variables that you're including. So all the variables, which are the data points that you're collecting data on, they may be continuous variables like the number of days of illness before presentation, or that's a continuous variable. Or a child's temperature is a continuous variable. The respiratory rate is a continuous variable. Or they might be binary, such as the whether or not the child had anemia, yes or no. So that's a binary variable. It can also be a continuous variable depending on how you measure it, because you could, hemoglobin is a continuous variable, but anemia is a binary variable. It's just yes or no. And sometimes you'll include both of those things, the hemoglobin and the whether or not the child had anemia. And there's value in including both of those variables depending on what you're studying. Sometimes variables will be categorical. That is, they may fall into certain categories of let's say you're studying pneumonia, and you might want to say that a child to record the severity of pneumonia. So pneumonia is classified as mild, moderate, or severe. There are three categories, right? And you might also record the respiratory rate, whether or not there was chest indrawing. So respiratory rate being a continuous variable, whether or not there was chest indrawing, which is a binary variable, whether or not the child was cyanosed, which is a binary variable, whether or not the child could feed adequately or wasn't able to feed, which is again a binary variable, and then whether or not the child had mild, moderate, or severe pneumonia, which is a categorical variable. It's like three categories, isn't it? It's mild, moderate, or severe. It's not continuous. In your spreadsheet, so they're the three types of variables. In your spreadsheet, you should, if you have yes or no responses, like it's a binary variable, did they have anemia or not, then record your data. You can record it as yes or no, but it's probably better to record it as 1 or 0, right? Then it makes it analyzable. You can transform your database or your spreadsheet. If you put all yeses and nos, then it's so easy to change it from yes to 1 and no to 0. But if you get used to just putting 1s and 0s, you'll always know what that means. Now, if you're putting in continuous variables such as weight or length or head circumference or MUAC, they're all continuous variables. The duration of illness, they're numerical, but only record them to a fixed number of decimal places. And that fixed number of decimal places should be realistic, right? And so, for example, if you're recording a child's head circumference, then you can't do that to 3 decimal places, right? It's not 36.541 because the precision of our measurement doesn't go beyond 0.1 of a decimal, 1 decimal place. So it could be 36.5, but it can't be 36 point multiple decimal places. I know that is obvious for head circumference, but sometimes when people put in continuous variables, they use too many decimal places that don't reflect the precision of the tools that they're using for measurement. All right. And so it should be with each variable, you should decide how many decimal places. It might be 0. So if you're measuring how many days the child was unwell, then it's unlikely that a parent will remember the exact time a child became unwell. So you can't put 6.5 days because most parents' recall doesn't go to that precise amount of time. It doesn't go to half days. So that number of duration of illness shouldn't have anything more. It shouldn't have any decimal places. I hope that makes sense. Whereas weight, if you're measuring it in kilograms, then you might measure depending on the size of the child, you might measure it to 1 decimal place. So it could be 15.6 kilograms. Or if you're looking at neonates, you might measure it in grams or in 2 decimal places because it's 3.46 kilograms. That the precision of the measurement should match that of the tools that you're using for measurement. So the weighing scales, etc. Don't overstate the precision of your measurements depending on the tools that you're using. I hope that makes sense. Sometimes people, when they're measuring continuous variables, they put them in categories. So, for example, the duration of illness prior to presentation, they might put it as less than 2 days, 2 to 4 days, 4 to 6 days, more than 7 days. That's not appropriate. Don't record continuous variables in categories. You just lose data that way. You won't be able to analyze it. And so in your data collection form, don't record it that way. Record it as a continuous variable. In your spreadsheets, record it as a continuous variable. And then you'll be able to do proper analysis on it. So I wanted to show some data, some spreadsheets that are not very good. Not very good, and point out what the problems with them are. Several problems. There's a multitude of problems with this spreadsheet. The first one is that the top row should have your variable names. You shouldn't have more than 1 top row with variable names. A lot of people do that, but don't do that because it's not analyzable. Because statistical programs always recognize the top row as being variable names and everything under that being your data, patients or whatever, usually patients. So everything below the top row is your data. And so the top row only represents the variable names. So don't have 2 or 3. I've seen 3 top rows with variable levels. It's not, that won't be analyzable. The second thing is you can see that, so for example, here with age, the person who made up this database used lots of different metrics. And one, for example, it says 30 days, another one is 2 months, another one is days, another one is months. You can see one is 1 week, right? So that is not analyzable because there are multiple different metrics to represent the same variable. This variable neonate, I guess it was supposed to be a binary variable, either the baby was a neonate or not. Well, they've started off okay with 1 and then they put no instead of a 0. So that's not analyzable. The diagnosis is not analyzable because here they've put sepsis, malnutrition, and then infection, and then SAM, and then severe malnutrition or SEV malnutrition. And so the diseases or the diagnoses are not written in a uniform way. And so I'll show you the way to do that. The one with blood pressure, this is a real database that somebody developed. The one with blood pressure 90/30, no statistical program can analyze that because it's not a number. Here in weight, there's 2.8 kilograms and then 3,500 grams, and then 6.1 without any metric, and 1,500 grams. Again, like age, this variable has been the person who made up this database didn't think about the metric of measurement they were going to use and the decimal places they would that were valid for that particular metric. Similar for cough, and this variable, cough duration. So sometimes it's days, sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it's a question mark, and again, a statistical program won't be able to analyze that. You have to standardize the way you describe the data, every data point. You should use numbers where you can, and as I said, decide on the number of decimal places, and decide whether your durations are in days, weeks, months, hours, whatever, depending on the study and on the question that you're asking of that particular outcome. But for outcome, the outcome died, survived, that's often a binary outcome, died or survived, but sometimes there are other categories such as absconded or etc. It's best to use, again, a standard form of metric. So survived or died, but discharged would also be survived. So it's the same thing, but it's written in a different way. Absconded is a different category. It's not analyzable, basically, this type of thing. Yeah. Okay. This is the much better way to develop the same database. And I've gone through and revised the database completely to make sure that it's analyzable. And I hope you can see how it's different. So here for sex, instead of having MF female, it's now males are 1, females are 0. It could be the other way around. Doesn't matter. The age is in all metrics are months. Okay, so it's 1, 2, 4. Much older children it's 123. It's still months, right? That's 10 years, isn't it? 10 years and 3 months. If the baby's a neonate, then they're not even a month of age. If they're 3 weeks of age, then it's about 0.6. You can calculate exactly based on the number of weeks, but transform that into months. Okay. If they're only a week of age, then it's 0.25 months. If they're only a day of age, it's 0.03 months, etc. Here, this neonate, instead of being 1 and no, it's 1 and 0. Okay. For the diagnoses, usually it's better to have separate columns for each diagnosis. And then you can have a child having multiple diagnoses. So they might have, it might be, they might have pneumonia and HIV and malnutrition. And then you don't have to write it as pneumonia, HIV, malnutrition. You can put a separate column for each of the diseases you're wanting to study in that population. For the blood pressure, remember it was 90 on 30 before. Well, again, that's not analyzable, but you can analyze the systolic blood pressure or the diastolic blood pressure because it's just a number. You can say what the average systolic blood pressure is in the population and what the average diastolic blood pressure is in the population. That's what you can do in terms of analysis. But if you have anything but a number there, then no computer program will be able to analyze it. The weight is the same. Remember, choose the metric and choose the number of decimal places that you want to use. The same with the duration of cough and the outcome being 1 or 0, survived or died, right? Okay. You'll notice then from this how much missing data there is, and that's okay, but at least you can be clear when you look at the spreadsheet for how many patients was there missing data. For example, in the child who absconded, then the outcome is uncertain, so that's just left blank. For many of the children, they didn't get their blood pressure taken in this study, so they're just left blank. This is even better. This was a spreadsheet that is a real spreadsheet that was part of a study that was done from at a master's level, and again, each of the variables has their own column. Each of the variables has their own metric of measurement that's very clear. The number of decimal places for which that metric has been allocated, etc., and it has the outcome. Now, in this study, the study was looking at a variety of different diagnoses at presentation. So children with severe pneumonia, HIV, TB, congenital heart disease, malaria, meningitis, and other. And you'll notice there's a mixture of letters and numbers here. That's okay for occasionally, and especially because it's a not so important variable, right? This will just help you identify just the other diagnoses that were in that patient population. You don't need to go to the full extent, for example, of having a separate column for renal tubular acidosis or hookworm, because that's so rare within that population. So whereas TB was much more common and HIV and severe anemia was much more common, etc. All right. I hope that makes sense. So I've said most of this before. Don't break up continuous variables into categories. All right, the number of people in the household, less than 4, 5 to 8, greater than 8. That's not the way to do it. Just put the actual number. Put the actual number. Well, and the reason for that is when you record continuous data as a category, it can't be analysed. You can't work out what the mean or median of that continuous variable is, and you lose information. You lose the precision of the information that you've gathered. A computer won't understand greater than or less than signs. So maybe later on, when you're displaying the information in your thesis, you might categorize the data later, but it's not for data entry or for data analysis. I said to use the same metric of measurement consistently in any variable. So you don't record the age in months for some and the years for others and some for days. Just record it in a standard way. A newborn baby on day 1. If you're studying children of all ages, you might want to measure their age in months or in years, add fractions of years, for example. But if you're studying young infants, then you'd probably want to measure it in months, in fractions of a month, or even in days, depending on the age of the population you're studying. But it should be uniform for all the entire population. Okay, I want to get on to just the writing parts of it now. Yeah, I just want to say a few things that I hope that'll help you in the next month. The first thing, which I've said to you before, is that you've done a lot of work already with your ethics proposal and with your when most people have written an ethics proposal or some other document that describes your study. And so you can use that introduction and the methods for your thesis. Now, usually you need to expand on that. You need to change the tense from being future tense to being a past tense, because instead of proposing you'll do the study, you've actually done the study. And usually you need to expand it substantially, and you need to review your method and see whether or not exactly what you proposed doing is what you did. But it's not a wasted document. That's my point, and you can use that to expand into your thesis. I've talked about the structure before. I won't talk any more about that, except to say that what the different components of your study are, that your thesis are. The introduction is why you've done the study. The description of the issue that your study was addressing. It's not an extensive literature review, and it doesn't have to be very long. You can, as I said, you can add a separate literature review, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be something relatively brief that just describes in enough detail for people to understand why you did the study and what issue it was addressing, and maybe something of what previous studies have done, but not a lot about that. The method should be, as I said, very detailed. It should be concise, and a description of exactly what was done, what you actually did, so that somebody else could take that method and reproduce it in another study. The results is what you found, and the discussion is what it means. I'll talk a bit more about results and discussion as we go along. The tables, as I said, you can develop them. You could have developed them months ago. When you're doing your study, you should develop your tables so that you know what data how you're going to display your data. And they'll talk a bit about writing and managing your documents and word tools for document writing, which is, again, getting a bit more advanced. But the tables, as I said, you can create dummy tables to plan your data presentation. And most papers have 2 or 3 tables. So most minor theses have 2 or 3 tables, sometimes more, rarely less, but sometimes more. They'll usually have a table of the demographics of your population, so a baseline data table, and they'll usually have a couple of results tables. Now, remember that the tables and any figures that you put in your thesis should augment your narrative text. It shouldn't replace your narrative text, and your narrative text shouldn't just reproduce what your tables show. They shouldn't go through every data point in your table and say what they are, because the reader can just look at your tables. So you should reference every table in your narrative text. See table 1 for background or baseline data on the population. And then your narrative text should emphasize the important points that table reflects, right? It doesn't have to state all the results, but emphasize the important points, the important results. So that orientates the reader to, when they're looking at the table, to know what results they should be looking at, all right? Or what results you think are important to address the question that you posed in the first place. So this is the dummy tables of Dr. Michael Landy's study, which I thought was excellent on, it was a point prevalence survey of severe malnutrition at Port Moresby General Hospital. And he did a baseline survey, an intervention, and then a survey, and then a second post-intervention survey to see whether or not the results were sustained over a period of time. And these were the dummy tables he developed. So his baseline survey, first post-intervention survey, and second follow-up survey. And this is the dummy tables. And then he was able to then populate the dummy tables with data from his spreadsheets. And this is the data that he was able to populate with. And again, the metric of measurement should be clear. So this is the age of patients in months and the interquartile range, right? Which is a standard way to present the age of a population, right? And he had three populations in it, was because it was three different time points. It wasn't looking at the same children over a period of time. It was 3-point prevalence surveys within the hospital. And so you can see that there was some differences in ages between the three patient population groups. But the point is, by developing dummy tables, he was able to then easily populate them based on his spreadsheet. And it helps you road test your spreadsheet and make sure that you can answer the questions, present the data that you need to present based on your spreadsheet. This is whether or not a child had comorbidities, and this is the number who had a comorbidity. So 14 out of the 125 had extrapulmonary TB, and that means, or maybe, no, sorry, it was 14 out of 43 out of the children who had severe malnutrition. And so therefore 32.6% of those children with severe malnutrition had extrapulmonary TB. 10 out of the 43 had diarrhea, and so that's 23.3%. So working out what the metric of measurement is, the number of decimal places you'll present your data to, and putting them in a dummy table is very helpful. He also had a results table, so that's like the baseline demographics, and then he had a results table which looked at, for example, the results being whether or not the average day of initiation of feeds was less after the intervention and was sustained at less, and whether the weight gain was more in these patients after the intervention. And what you can see is, after populating his dummy tables, you could see that the average duration of initiation of feeds was about the same between the intervention periods, but the average or the median weight gain was very much more, and it was sustained over time, from 1.5 grams per kilogram per day to 5 in the immediate post-survey to 10 grams per kilo per day in the second post-survey. So I guess the point is about the dummy tables. If you plan your study and your analysis beforehand, then you can populate your thesis with results when you've done your data collection and data entry. So that's the results. Remember, all your tables need to be referenced. They need to be cited in your narrative results description. I wanted to say something in the last point. I want to say something about the discussion and what the discussion is and what it isn't. So a discussion is not just another section where you repeat what you wrote in the results. It's very different. You do not repeat the results you wrote in your discussion. You can't introduce or comment upon any new results that you did not include in your results. So your results is only your results. Your discussion is not about repeating your results. It's a part of your thesis where you summarize the key findings. And I always think it's useful to have an opening sentence where you summarize the key findings in an opening paragraph. Your discussion is about the interpretation of your results, what they mean. You can restate, and you should restate, your key findings or your key lessons, the key lessons that have been learned from your study. Restate your key findings in an opening paragraph, but don't repeat the results, like the numbers that you wrote in the results, unless they're very pertinent to an understanding of the key findings. And don't introduce or comment on any new result that you did not include in your results. So you can't suddenly include a new result in your discussion. You'd have to have put it in the results section. Your discussion should also be about comparing and contrasting your main results with the results from other studies, right? And so that's why you've done your literature search. You can then include a paragraph on each of the studies that are relevant to your study and how they were similar and how they were different. And your discussion should also include a limitations section where you understand the limitations of your study and also the other people's studies. I wanted to say something about limitations because sometimes people just write a list of limitations without really saying why they're limitations or how you could do it better. And so many people just often write, well, it was too small and we didn't have time to follow them up and we didn't have enough time to recruit more patients. Sure, there are limitations, but you have to understand why such things are limitations. Well, a small study you can have a valid result in a small study. That's not always a problem. But sometimes when you've done a small study, it's limited because that patient population might not be representative of a wider population. That if you continue to gather patients or continue to interview patients or parents or families or whatever, then that might be more representative. You might be limited in your representation by your number of subjects you recruited. Or maybe there's a risk of what's called a type 2 error. And again, I don't have time to go into this, but if you've done a study looking at the efficacy of a certain therapy, but your study is very small, then you risk having a type 2 error. And the type 2 error is not finding a difference when a difference really existed. And so you might find that there's no difference between two different therapies, but that might just be because you've got a type 2 error and the study, the sample size was too small. Another limitation that people don't always recognize in their studies, but is very important, is the high loss to follow-up rate. And so often when we try to follow up patients, we have high loss to follow-up rates. And the important point is that the patients you're able to follow up are not the same as the patients you weren't able to follow up. They will be different in some way. They'll be different because they might live further away, or they might have different rates of literacy, or they might have even different outcomes. They might be more likely to have been well or more likely to have been sick, depending on the issue at hand. So the thing to remember is that those that you were lost to follow up will be different to those that were followed up. They won't be the same type of population. So the results, if you have high loss to follow-up rates, might not be representative of the wider population that you intended to study. If your loss to follow-up rate is less than 20%, then usually your study will be fully representative. That will be sufficient. But when you've got loss to follow-up rates, as I've seen on occasions of more than 50%, then certainly the patient population that you're able to follow up is going to be different. So therefore, your results of that in that population will be different. And so you just need to recognize that. Often we don't follow up patients for a sufficient time, and we might follow them up for a very short period of time, and we have a high loss to follow-up rate. And so you don't really know what happened to the patients. You have some idea because they got discharged and they seem to be okay, but you don't always know what happened to the patients. And sometimes even your primary outcome will have an inadequate duration of follow-up to determine the primary outcome that you intended to determine in the first place. And sometimes, lastly, I suppose in terms of limitations, the methodology that you chose, because of, I would say, practical reasons, expedient or practical reasons, logistical reasons, was actually suboptimal to answer the question. And you can sometimes identify that by looking at better studies that have been done in other places about the same question, and they might have used a different a different methodology that took longer, that had more intensive follow-up, that had larger sample sizes, etc., and were able to answer the question with more precision and more accuracy than you're able to answer in a small study. That doesn't mean your study's bad or anything. It just means that your methodology was suboptimal to answer the question. It still can be a useful exploratory study that can be used to build on other studies. So, for example, there's a couple of studies that have been done this year looking at, say, outcomes of HIV-exposed babies and about TB-HIV co-infection. They're both excellent topics. They're excellent studies, but the follow-up rate is not enough to understand what's happened to those patients. So they may be used to expand into a larger cohort, more longitudinal cohort study that would provide much more information about those important populations. And I hope that those who've done those studies will be able to do them at a master's level and continue them on over the next few years. Okay, I just want to say a few things about writing and managing documents, most of which I think I've talked about before. You should have a single master document that you can use for your proposal and your thesis and a manuscript if you're writing one. We've talked about that before. You should set aside time every week, at least from now, but you should have set aside time at the start to work on your study and writing your thesis. And you should keep your supervisor informed and interested in your study and your thesis progress. Your supervisors are busy people, but keep them informed. And you should don't forget, back up all your data and your documents. I want to say something about writing style, and you should try to, as I said, be concise. 2,500 to 4,000 words is enough. When you're writing, then these are just lessons in concise writing. Each sentence should have one idea, not more than one idea, just one idea. Each sentence in a paragraph should be linked. So you don't introduce different ideas that aren't linked in the same paragraph. So if you have a different idea or a different an idea that's not linked to that previous sentence, then it's a new paragraph. Don't use jargon or slang. We get into the habit of using jargon and abbreviations all the time, and that's not very good in thesis writing. You can use verbatim quotes in qualitative research. Put them in quotation marks, and if the quotes are in, I've used an abbreviation here, but it's a commonly used one, language other than English. So if your quotes are in Pidgin, then you should put underneath it the English translation. So it's really good to write it in Top Pidgin and then underneath write the English translation. That's if you're using verbatim quotes. I always try to avoid abbreviations. You should avoid them, but you can use generally accepted abbreviations like WHO or like MDR-TB, but even those, for the first time you use an abbreviation, you should define it. So the child was found to have multi-resistant tuberculosis, MDR-TB, on GeneXpert and later TB culture. You've defined it, defined what MDR-TB means, so that the reader, even if they don't have an understanding of abbreviations, they will of the topic, they will understand what that abbreviation means. Never use an abbreviation that you haven't defined. Even WHO, you should write World Health Organization in brackets WHO the first time you use it, and then subsequently in your thesis you can use the abbreviation. You shouldn't use ambiguous abbreviations, and then there are many that are ambiguous, as in they might have two meanings. So TOF, is it tetralogy of Fallot or is it a tracheoesophageal fistula? That's just one example of an ambiguous abbreviation. So don't use obscure abbreviations and don't use ambiguous abbreviations. Only use abbreviations that are generally well accepted, and always define them the first time you use them when you're writing. I wanted to say something about the tools within Word, the Word program for document writing. And I just want to briefly talk about headings and subheadings, because that can be done just manually. Mostly we just write it manually, but there is a tool within Word that you can use to generate a table of contents. And I find it very useful. I won't talk about reference manager programs, but some people will have learned how to use EndNote, and that can be a useful tool for your thesis as well. I've just taken the thesis from Dr. Leilani Saweri from Altau last year. It's a very good thesis. And I want to describe how you can use the function within Word that that enables you to develop a table of contents. And so you can, for example, in a thesis document, you have a hierarchy of headings. And so the heading number one, the top of the hierarchy is your main title of your thesis. Heading two will be like the main sections, the abstract, the introduction, the methods, results, and discussion, etc. So the main heading, that's heading two. And heading three will be the smaller subtitles within those sections, within the methods. It might be within methods, it might be patient population, measurements, it might be ethics, funding, for example. You might have subsections within those the main sections, subsections. So heading one is the main heading, and you can, if you click on heading one, you can make that font whatever you like, whatever you want heading one to be. And all your heading ones, there's usually only one heading one, but all of your heading ones will be the same. Heading two will be the same. So methodology, you can change that to being 13-point and Arial font, a color if you like, or it can be standard. And then you can make sure all of the heading twos are the same. Same with heading three. So in this study, heading two was the main sections like methodology. Heading three were things like subsections. So study setting and recruitment. That's a heading three, and that's a different font, and it's different line spacing, etc. You can choose the font and the line spacing and the color and the size, and you can then make all your heading twos uniform and your heading threes uniform. The way to make them uniform is to highlight the heading, one of the headings, and then you right click on heading three and say update heading three to match selection, and that will automatically change all your heading threes to that style that you've chosen. Right. The point of doing that is that after selecting all your heading types, you can generate a table of contents at the beginning of your thesis. So you put your cursor at the beginning of your thesis, so after your title page, and you then select from we're in the review section of the in the review section of Word, and you go to table of contents and you add a table of contents. And so this is the section you do. You need to make sure before you do that no other text in your thesis is labeled as a heading type. Sometimes you find that a text underneath a heading becomes labeled as that heading type, but make sure that all that other text is just labeled as normal text rather than the heading type. And then from the table of contents, you can highlight the style of heading that you want. And so in this circumstance, this was the style of heading that we chose, heading one, heading two, and heading three. And then it automatically generates this table of contents. And I'll just show you, this is Leilani's table of contents where she had the title and the page number. So the point of going through that process is it makes your thesis look much better. It has standardized headings throughout, and it has a standard table of contents with a hierarchy of headings throughout. And you can see the heading, heading 1 was the main title, heading 2 was the main section titles, and heading 3 were the subsections underneath that. Okay, now I've talked to you a lot about writing your thesis today, and I know it's getting late in the process. You've got a month to go, but I wanted to just emphasize one point at the end. And the first thing is it will be okay. You've all done great projects and you presented them really well last week, and you'll be able to write your theses. I've just tried to give you some tools and some tips for how to do it better. Remember, there's no one right way to write a thesis. There's lots of different ways. I've just given you one way. And you don't need to master all the things I've described today, the complex tools in Word or a reference manager program like EndNote, or even spreadsheets or statistics to do well in the research component of your assessment. You don't need to master those things, but I've tried to give you an understanding of those things so you can work towards knowing about them and mastering them in the future. If you're just starting your DCH, then hopefully sometime during this next 5 years, you'll learn more about them. And if you're finishing your masters, I think you've been exposed to most of these things and you'll produce a good thesis anyway. But you might want to use these tools and these skills on an ongoing basis. And remember, most of the reason for doing research is to make us better pediatricians, to make us think better and make us better clinicians. That's why we do research. And many of these skills translate into being a really good pediatrician. So that's why I've spent some time trying to teach you these. And in the end, it's about content and quality that matters most. It's not about length. It's not about how fancy your thesis looks or how polished it is. It's about content and quality that matters most. You need to practice writing concisely because it's a skill that all of us have to learn. I know I had to learn it when I was starting my research, and I was taught how to write concisely, and you need to practice that. Again, it's a skill that is very important for communication. And if you learn to write concisely, you'll also learn to speak concisely. And that's something that as a clinician, as a doctor, you need to learn to be able to speak concisely to your patients, to your colleagues, to give lectures, to give speeches, whatever. And remember, when you've done your thesis, when your thesis is done, make sure you have someone else read it to see if they can understand it. I'm happy to read your thesis in the coming weeks, and I'm sure your other supervisors will be happy as well. Right. Well, that's all I wanted to say today. That I know it's a lot, but I wanted to finish on that note. And I thought I'd send you this recording so that you can look at it in your spare time. And then on Monday at midday, we will. I'm happy to answer any questions. I won't be going over it again, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I think it'd be better to have a session where we just discussed your particular questions or your thesis. So I hope that's been helpful. And I'm going to stop the recording now. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.